And it's a very important thing that will be helpful for you to know from the Greek language about this passage. If you look at Matthew 25:37, the word for feed that is used there is the Greek athrepsamen. Athrepsamen doesn't mean ladling soup into bowls that you then give to homeless people, right? That's not athrepsamen. That word athrepsamen means something very intimate, very, very personal, than is conveyed by that English word feed. It means to nourish or support or nurture and nurse, like a mother breastfeeding an infant. When Jesus uses the word feed, you can only feed the poor when you hold them to your own chest and share the substance of your own life with them as token and pledge of the provision of Christ, the host. So you see, a fast is not merely the transfer of food. A fast is the transfer of deep love and care. The food is always the glorious least of what is offered. Unfortunately, this kind of nourishment is not what most Christians do when they feed others. I want to share with you a blog entry in which the writer reports on sharing a can of chili with a homeless man. Christ appears in the story not as a host, but as a private inspiration to the giver, the person who wrote the story, who appears to believe that Christ is content with this role of having a private apartment in the writer's heart. Apparently the writer thinks that Christ's appearance as a host in the meal would be intrusive, would detract from the romance of the chili and the chit-chat, which the writer regards as a particularly poignant show of his own faith and his proof that, as he says in the blog post, God is so big. As big, apparently, as a can of chili, because unfortunately for the homeless man, the story concludes with the empty can of chili being the only evidence of this big God. The writer returns to law school, the homeless man returns back behind the gas station perhaps for another 10 years, and the writer's longing is for another, what he calls very scary, encounter with the homeless. It is unclear in the story that I'm going to share with you what the homeless man longs for or what Jesus longs for either. Here's what the writer writes. I have been praying for an opportunity to share my faith. That is a very scary prayer to pray. Sometimes I want to take it back because I'm so scared. Around noon today, I left my house to go to the law school. On the way, I remembered what we had discussed about getting some cans of soup and having it ready for homeless people if they ask. When I pulled up to the gas station, there was a guy sitting on the sidewalk. We greeted each other on my way in, but that was it. I bought 2 cans of chili and some spoons. On the way out, he asked if I had some spare change. I asked if he was hungry, and he said yes, so I gave him a can of chili. Then I asked if he minded if I sat with him. We talked for about 10 to 15 minutes. His name is Anthony. He's been homeless for about 10 years. He was really fun to talk to. I enjoyed his company. He seemed to enjoy mine. I can hardly describe what I felt after I left him. It was a deep joy, along with a deep pain. It may have come from the chili as I think about it. I ended up in the law school parking lot crying my eyes out. He told me he slept behind the Phillips 66 gas station last night. I didn't share my faith with him, but I showed my faith to him. God is so big. I just asked him for an opportunity, and there was Anthony sitting, waiting on me. I hope to talk to him some more. When Christians share a meal, that was the end of the story. This is back to me. When Christians share a meal with the poor, they are to host in Christ's name. They regard Christ, not the poor, as the host and the center of the meal. They recognize the poor as Christ's favored guests. They honor Christ by sharing openly that they treat the poor with the same honor as they would treat Christ because he insists on it because he is a gracious host. But they do not equate the poor with Christ. God does not call Christians to be Christ to the poor, nor does he call the poor to be Christ to Christians. They are means of grace to each other. That is, they are ways that we, host and guest both, can come to see and know Christ more deeply through the other. You see? Sometimes we act as if it is enough for Christ to be present at the meal just by being in our hearts or in our minds, not in our conversation. But the problem with that is that that robs everybody, the guest, the host, and most importantly, Christ himself. Christ is the friend of humanity, not just a God who wants to make sure everybody has a friend. Christ, when we exclude him from the feast, that's the same as excluding the poor from the feast. It excludes the fellowship between God and his creation. That's not good. The Christian is never the host. Just as the poor guest is never the guest of honor, Christ is both the host and the guest of honor, yet in his generosity, he shares the hosting privileges with the host and the invitation privileges with the guest. You see, for the Christian, the feast is Christ's open extension of hospitality and warm fellowship and friendship and love to the specific guest that Christ hosts at the table. And so when we eat with a real person, we have to remember they are not a generic container of poverty like the homeless. I ate with the homeless. The meal is not undertaken in an effort to better understand the problems of the poor. The meal is not an interview where we are trying to evaluate whether or not the guest deserves more help from us. And it's not a pity party where we mourn the guest's victimhood. None of those things. The meal is a token and a pledge that we will not withhold from this guest any portion of the gifts that Christ has entrusted to us on Christ's behalf. Jesus does not say, eat with the poor, figure out why they are poor, react accordingly. That's not what it says in the book. He says, eat together in my name. Here's the food. Share fellowship with each other and build relationships with me at the center.
Hear the word, do the word. .w